Welcome to Let's Talk New Mexico. I'm your host, Mark Haslett. New Mexico completed its first ever semi-open party primary elections last week. This morning, we're going to evaluate how that went and talk about what other changes could be on the horizon for the way we elect people to office. We're also going to take a look ahead to the general election coming up on November 3rd. Now that we know who's going to be on the ballot, we'll take a look at some of the candidates and races and whether those candidates are addressing issues that matter to voters. What do you think of open primaries and other proposed changes to the electoral process, like ranked choice voting? And when it comes to November's election, what issues are the most important to you? You can email us at letstalk@kunm.org or give us a call. The lines are open right now, 505-277-5866. That's 505-277-KUNM. Joining us this morning, we have in the studio Dee Feldman, former Democratic State Senator. We also have Merritt Allen, a former Republican State House candidate and owner of the Albuquerque-based PR firm Vox Optima. Also in the studio with us today is Bob Pearls, chair of the New Mexico Forward Party. He's also founder of New Mexico Open Elections, an organization that helped advance party primary election reform. And we're happy to welcome Marjorie Childress, who's in McKinley County. She's joining us by Zoom this morning. Marjorie is the managing editor of New Mexico In Depth and has been reporting on New Mexico public policy and politics since 2008. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Thank you.
We're going to turn to Dee first. Our first guest, Dee Feldman, served in the New Mexico Senate from 1997 to 2013. Thank you for joining us, Dee.
Thank you for having me.
As I mentioned earlier, we saw a big change in the way our state handles party primaries this year, allowing independents to vote as well as registered party members for the first time ever. As a longtime member of the Democratic Party, what are your thoughts on the semi-open primary format?
It's been a long time coming. I've always been a supporter of allowing the huge number of independents in New Mexico to vote in the primaries. Bob was involved with trying to get that for over 5 years.
10 years, yeah.
10 years, yeah. It took because of the opposition of both the Republican and the Democratic Party in the legislature. Finally got it, first with a halfway measure that was in effect the last election, whereby declined to state folks could vote, but they had to register with the party, and then if they wanted to maintain their DTS status, then they had to re-register as independent afterwards. This way, they just choose a Democrat or a Republican ballot, and that's great. It really increased turnout. I think declined to state folks now incorporate about 25 to 27% of our population, and many of these are young people. And there was a debate during the election which way they would go. Would they support the conservative Democrats, or how would they sway the election? The one thing we can say for certain is that they voted. Not all of them voted, of course. I think about 25% of the eligible declined to staters voted. And that's probably because they didn't know they could. But I think that's so important because our elections are often, the winners are actually determined in the primary because we have gerrymandered the whole map in such a way that most seats are safe and not competitive in the general election.
Well, we're going to say a bit more about that before we're done this morning, so we're going to return to that. We're going to introduce right now a conservative voice into the conversation. Merritt Allen is a former naval officer and the CEO of the Albuquerque communication and strategy firm Vox Optima. Merritt is also an opinion columnist, the founder of the center-right opinion website meritocracy.news. That's with 2 T's, because that's how Merritt is spelled.
And 2 R's.
And 2 R's.
The second R is silent.
And, well, Merritt, thank you so much for coming by. So you've described yourself as a lifelong conservative. And 8 years ago, you were a Republican candidate for the New Mexico House, but you're not involved with the Republican Party right now. Why is that?
Well, it was very hard for me in 2024 when I saw the national platform and I watched the 2024 Republican convention. It was hard to see myself in this populist, increasingly authoritarian, not fiscally conservative platform. The defense platform made no sense. The fiscal platform made absolutely, positively no sense. And there was nothing truly conservative in it. So I left. And, you know, I'd also been working with Bob in the New Mexico Open Elections nonprofit, and it finally succeeded, and I knew I was going to be able to vote in the primary. And from a conservative standpoint, you know, Republicans are all head up over truing the election and truing the vote, and somehow this is going to create voter fraud. And I come at it from kind of a fiscal conservative standpoint, and our elections are paid for by taxpayers. And when you have more than a quarter of the electorate who is an independent, they've jettisoned both parties. And when you deny them the opportunity in a publicly funded election, the opportunity to vote, I feel like that's just a completely inappropriate use of taxpayer dollars.
You, if one were to make a distinction between traditional conservatives and the current national leadership of the Republican Party, where does that leave conservatives in New Mexico who are uncomfortable with the current GOP but don't have any inclination to support New Mexico Democrats?
Well, I think you have to look for the better person. I think there are plenty of New Mexico Republicans who are fine people. You know, and we were just talking before the show began about labels. And, you know, there's the M word, there's, you know, MAGA. MAGA doesn't mean that you're awful. Perhaps you're misguided. And what I think we're also seeing is many in MAGA looking for an off-ramp because the profound corruption of this administration, whether it's the grift, whether it's the Epstein files, what time is it? Pick a new point of rot in this administration. Many people in the MAGA movement want out. Now, do I agree with them on points of policy and governance? No. And there are Democrats with whom I agree on many points. There are pro-business Democrats. And so I think you really have to look past labels. And you have to look at the person, and you have to look at their ethics, and you have to look at their voting record, and you have to pick a mixed ticket.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed, Merritt. We're going to turn right now to Marjorie Childress. She's joining us all the way from McKinley County, thanks to the magic of digital technology. Marjorie is the managing editor of New Mexico In Depth, and she's covered New Mexico public policy and politics since 2008. Thank you for joining us this morning, Marjorie.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Marjorie, how did Democratic centrists fare in this most recent primary in their races against their more progressive Democratic peers?
Not so great. I mean, I think there's been the story of primary elections for the past decade or so has been that there's a highly consequential battle that has been waged for control of the state house within the Democratic Party. And you've seen these primary elections over the course of a decade with these battles among the Democrats to build a larger progressive caucus in the state house. And they have largely succeeded. This year, we saw some people who used to hold these seats try to come back and get their seat back, and they were not successful. In fact, the only person who lost her seat through a primary challenge was arguably the person targeted by more of the progressive caucus. So yeah, I mean, the progressives held their ground, and they remain in charge of the State House, particularly the House of the State House.
That was the House District 27 in Albuquerque there. Hopefully we'll have time to come back and talk about that a little bit more in detail. I want to set that to one side for just a moment, but we're going to hold that thought. Marjorie, you've done quite a lot of reporting on campaign financing and the way it affects our political system. Could you describe how you see that dynamic affecting the primaries that we just had, and how might that dynamic affect the general election this fall? I understand that's quite a broad question, but you're welcome to select any aspect of it to highlight.
Well, I really focused during the primary on some really large dark money groups that came in during the primary. What we see in all of these election cycles are new groups that pop up to spend a lot of money, usually negative campaigning. But this election cycle, some of them also supported candidates. It's a lot of money that pours into our elections, and the structures that are set up by these groups make it very difficult for the public to know who's behind the spending. And we had numerous of those groups. They're basically PACs and nonprofits, funded by nonprofits that don't have to disclose their donors. And we had a really large one that spent almost $1 million in negative ads against Democrat Deb Haaland, who won the gubernatorial race. And we saw another group, New Chapter, New Mexico, come on the board that had a nonprofit funding it. This is the first time I have seen something that is this kind of, in my view, very overtly trying to not disclose donors. The group set up a nonprofit to fund itself. That's the way it appears to me. It shares some of the same directors. It's clear that they were in association with one another, and all of its funding came through this one nonprofit. And none of that money is disclosed to the public. And it really played in these legislative races we were just talking about, a lot of political advertising going out to the public. How does it affect races? Well, there's a big raging debate about whether or not negative advertising in particular works. It definitely has an impact. And, I think, the public hopefully has become more conversant in really scrutinizing where they're getting political advertising from, and should be asking questions about who's behind that advertising, because it matters.
You are listening to Let's Talk New Mexico. This morning we have in the studio, we're visiting right now with Marjorie Childress, who's talking to us from McKinley County. Marjorie is the managing editor of New Mexico in Depth. Coming up on Let's Talk New Mexico, we'll hear some from Bob Pearls. He's the chair of the New Mexico Forward Party, also founder of New Mexico Open Elections, which is an organization that helped advance primary election reform. And so we do have to go to a break, but stay with us. When we return, we will talk about electoral reform and where we stand right now, how we feel about the measures that have been taken, and what's coming up next. You're listening to Let's Talk New Mexico on 89.9 KUNM. What issues do you want the candidates to focus on in the upcoming gubernatorial election? Give us a call and tell us your thoughts. The lines are open, 505-277-5866. I'm Mark Haslett, and we have much more to come. Welcome to Let's Talk New Mexico. I'm Mark Haslett. We're talking about elections in New Mexico. You can email comments to letstalk@kunm.org or give us a call at 505-277-KUNM. Among our guests this morning, we have Bob Pearls. He's New Mexico State Chair of the Forward Party, a former New Mexico State Representative and former U.S. diplomat with the Department of State, currently the Honorary Consul for Germany in New Mexico. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us about the Forward Party and its basic principles.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I spent 10 years working on passing the open primaries bill. What I learned during that period of time was that 80% of New Mexicans are deeply frustrated and disenfranchised from both major parties. 51% of Americans, based on a recent Gallup poll, self-identify as independents. And although it was very exciting to finally, after 10 years, help pass the semi-open primaries bill, it was very clear that the current legislature is nowhere close to passing additional meaningful democracy reform measures, proportional representation, independent districting commissions, term limits, either public financing or more meaningful limits on spending, especially as Marjorie had said, all of this dark money, which has deeply corrupted our political process. And so I decided that instead of trying to beat my head up against the wall and pass something like nonpartisan primaries with ranked choice voting in the general like Alaska has, and we can talk more about that the next step was really to found and push a political party that's deeply dedicated to democracy reform measures. Some of the listeners might recall that Andrew Yang, for example, ran for president in 2020 as a Democrat. He's one of the three main national co-founders of the Forward Party. And the Forward Party is deeply dedicated to upholding the rule of law, upholding the Constitution, entrepreneurship, and most importantly, democracy reform measures. Neither one of the major parties are terribly committed to that. They fight and battle and compete, and then they collude to exclude competition. So the Forward Party is about creating competition in races, trying to elect new and different members to the State House and the State Senate who will support these important democracy measures that will change the incentive system so that politicians have to listen to left, right, and center, not just the party base, and hopefully elect new candidates who will support these critical democracy reform measures to enfranchise more voters, enthuse more voters, stop the negative campaigning, stop the yelling and screaming, and actually have civil discourse.
Former longtime Las Cruces mayor, Ken Miyagishima, he's running for governor as an independent. He's also suing the New Mexico Secretary of State's office because he says independent candidates face unfair obstacles to make the ballot. Do you think he has a point?
Absolutely. I know Ken well. I co-hosted a town hall meeting with Ken in Las Cruces in January, along with Tilly Villalobos, who lost her primary election in House District 37. Ken has a point. A lot of people don't realize the discriminatory elements of New Mexico law when it comes to ballot access. Talking about statewide races like the governor, Republicans and Democrats need about 2,500 signatures to get on the ballot. That's a huge undertaking. Minor parties like the Forward Party, because we're the most recently qualified new party in New Mexico, we need 7,200 signatures to get on the ballot. An independent candidate needs 15,000. And one way to look at that, in my mind, is not only is it discriminatory, but it's a poll tax. In other words, you have to have tens of thousands of dollars to hire professional signature gatherers to hit this astronomical number of 15,000. And the way I can prove it's ridiculous is that there is no time in New Mexico history when an independent candidate ever got on the ballot in our entire state history. Not only have we never elected an independent to statewide office, they've never even qualified. And so my party is lining up a very strong legal team to make sure that our candidates, if we don't hit our 7,200, that we don't get kicked off the ballot, because even that threshold is very challenging.
You're listening to Let's Talk New Mexico. We're discussing elections in New Mexico. We're taking a look at the structural aspect of elections, talking about how they are organized. We've been mentioning the semi-open party primaries, and we're also discussing some of the races, both the primaries that just concluded and the upcoming general election and the races there. In the studio, we have Dee Dee Feldman, former Democratic State Senator, Merritt Allen, who is the owner of the Albuquerque-based PR firm Vox Optima. We just heard from Bob Pearls, chair of the New Mexico Forward Party, and we also have Marjorie Childress of New Mexico in Depth. I'm going to be presenting questions to everyone now that we've all gotten warm and weighed in a little bit. And on the topic of that semi-open primary, independents voted in the Democratic primary at a rate of 3 votes for every 1 independent who voted in the Republican primary. I'm looking at something here. Actual numbers says of the more than 33,000 ballots cast by independents, around 25,000 were in the Democratic primary compared to nearly 9,000 ballots cast in the Republican primary. What do you think that tells us about the independent vote in New Mexico?
If I could weigh in, I
Sure.
think there simply weren't enough choices on the statewide races to make the Republican ballot interesting. And that's a failure of the Republican Party of New Mexico to recruit candidates. And it's the Republican RPNM is somewhat broken. We don't have a chair, I think. A judge directed the chair who was sitting in the seat against the party's own bylaws. And so I think the chair has finally stepped down. It's not clear. All the communications are coming out from the first vice chair and not the chair. And there might be a state central committee meeting, but we don't know. And the party was so focused on keeping this chair illegally that they managed to not recruit a candidate for Senate, United States Senate, for state treasurer, for state auditor. And that's embarrassing. And so, Republicans also didn't turn out, because they their turnout, 25% of Republicans, registered Republicans, came out to vote. 1 out of 4 and 1 out of 3 Democrats turned out. So that's not good. That's not a good sign.
So you're seeing that as evidence not of a lack of Republicans, but lack of options for Republicans?
Right. Republicans just in general didn't turn out. So conservative independents just saw, why bother?
Yes, Bob.
I just wanted to mention that the Forward Party is primarily founded around representing independent voters. So I'll sort of speak on behalf of independent voters. I've been a registered independent voter for the last 10 years, and most of the independent voters in this state want to pick and choose, as Merritt said earlier, between really strong candidates who generally are not tightly aligned with the far left or the far right. And so it's not that independents are going to swing more heavily Democratic, even though, 2/3 of them seem to have voted in the Democratic primary. What they saw was the high visibility of the Bregman-Holland race, and that pulled them over. Whereas I know the 3 Republican candidates pretty well. I probably know Duke and Doug better than I know Greg Hull. And there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm. Not saying that the 3 of them couldn't have brought a lot to the table, but there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm. There wasn't a lot of money spent. And so when independents are allowed to vote for the first time in the state's history, number one, the turnout's going to be lower because most independents didn't know they could vote. And number two, those who did vote didn't really know a lot about the Republican side of the ballot, so they swung over to the Democrats. But believe me, in the general, don't assume that independents are going to generally swing Democrat. That's not necessarily the case.
But it sets a good tone for the general election, because what I was so excited about in the Republican primary is it's the first primary I've seen in over a decade where the emotional blackmail litmus tests were not present. And Trump was nowhere in the Republican primary, which is shocking. The Democratic primary was super Trumpy. You know, who was on Epstein's plane, who's got the MAGA donors. That was all in the Democrat primary. I was stunned. And the Republican primary was actually about issues like child welfare, education, medical malpractice, the economy, you know, the issues that actually are going to propel our state forward. So if that continues in the general election, that could give Greg Hull an edge.
Dee Dee, I can tell you have thoughts.
Look, this is a Democratic state.
Is it?
Yeah, this is a Democratic state.
We just don't have a functioning Republican Party.
Well, that contributes to why it's a Democratic state. But, you know, the Democratic primary is where the action is. It's where the most likely candidate is going to be the governor of New Mexico. So, of course, people are going to be interested in that. And I think that also you really need to look at the demographics of independents also, the ages of independents. The age is much younger than a registered Republican or a registered Democrat. So I think it's likely that they're disillusioned with both parties, but the lesser of both evils is the Democrat. So I'm not surprised that 74% voted Democrat. And also, I think the fact that they did vote Democrat in such large numbers reveals why the Democratic Party is kind of afraid of really empowering independents. We have had a case where a minor party, the Green Party, did get on the ballot back in 1992 when Bob was in the legislature, and it swung the election away from the Democrat Bruce King to the newcomer Gary Johnson. And so I think since that time, Democrats have been pretty wary of allowing more rights for independents.
Yeah, let me jump in because I hear the spoiler argument all the time against minor parties. And I have two reactions. One is the Democrats have the power overnight in 2027 to eliminate the spoiler effect by going to some kind of proportional representation method, whether it's approval voting, star voting, ranked choice voting, what's called proportional representation or multi-member districts. And so the 50% of New Mexicans who are deeply frustrated with both parties are only going to put up with that argument for so long. So that's the number one argument. Number two is that at least in this election cycle, the forward party's targeting non-competitive races. The listeners need to realize that 80% of all races in New Mexico in the general election are non-competitive. And so we can become the second biggest party in the state simply by running good mainstream candidates in races where there's only one Democrat and one Republican and no spoiler effect.
The listeners can't see what I can see, which is Marjorie Childress in McKinley County, and she's smiling. I know she has something to say. But Marjorie, we're going to get to you in a moment. Before we do, I want to get some terms that might not be familiar to everybody listening. Proportionate representation, star voting. Just briefly, could you explain those?
Sure. We have a system in America which is very different than most worldwide democracies, and it's called winner take all. And so you could have every state representative and every state senator win by 51% of the vote in their district, and 49% of the voters are then unrepresented because 100% of the seats go to all these candidates who win with maybe 51% of the vote. That's an extreme example. So proportional representation, for example, you could divide New Mexico into quadrants, and 10 of the state Senate seats could come from a quarter of New Mexico, and people could vote for 10 or 15 candidates, and the top 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 vote getters get a seat in the state Senate, so that hitting 5 or 10% threshold would allow a minor party or an independent or a libertarian or, God forbid, a more conservative Democrat or a more moderate Republican to actually gain a seat.
So in a way, it's kind of modifying the system a bit so that you can have parliamentary-style proportional representation in a federalist system. Is that an accurate way to describe it?
Yeah, I wouldn't describe it as parliamentary. That gets complex. But, for example, ranked choice voting, which has become sort of a demonic term by certain elements of the Republican Party, unfortunately.
Not
where
mine.
Good. Well, that's why Merritt's left the Republican Party
me.
right now.
Not me.
But with ranked choice voting or approval voting or star voting, there are different methods of somebody. Imagine walking into a restaurant and you say, hey, my first choice are tacos. And if you're out of tacos, my second choice is enchiladas. And if you're out of enchiladas, I want some chalupas. That's all you're doing. You're saying, hey, this Democrats, or better yet, an example is this Forward Party member is my first choice. But since that's a relatively unknown party, if the Forward Party doesn't win, my second choice is this independent. If he doesn't win, my third choice is this Democrat. Fourth choice is Republican. And it's a very logical way to rank what you want. And it allows folks who are outside of the strict litmus test that both parties have in their primaries. And it allows folks with a diversity of thought, a diversity of background to actually have a shot at getting elected.
Marjorie, I know you have some thoughts. Help us out here. I know you've been listening. Tell me your reactions to some of the things we've been discussing so far.
Well, I think I have a little bit of a different kind of take on why 3/4 of independents voted in the Democratic primary. So first of all, I think independents, it's not a monolithic group. I mean, we don't really, and it's growing significantly because of our automatic voter registration that went into effect almost a year ago. So it's a large group of people who we don't necessarily, they're not like their own party. They go different directions. I don't think we can say they're all moderate. They might be less partisan, which is, that's like we don't really know, right? So this election, to me, one of the big takeaways from this primary election, I mean, we were all going to look back on it as the first semi-open primary, but it was also one of these moments when we had incredible fervor among the Democrats to come out and vote. I mean, I think Democrats are fired up. There was a huge turnout this primary election. It was much bigger than the previous midterm cycles in recent history. And it was not all independents who came out and produced that. It was Democrats. Democrats, I think Merritt said earlier, it was 1 in 3 of them came out for the primary. It was a big turnout by Democrats. And, the very striking data point for me is that the results of the Democratic primary for the gubernatorial race were almost identical to the pre-primary convention results. The pre-primary convention is a small group of party insiders who gather together to vote on who makes their ballot. And that's part of that system that Bob was talking about that is a little exclusionary. When the Democrats gathered in March for the pre-primary convention, they gave Deb Haaland, I think it was around 72%, 73%, something like that. And the conventional wisdom is that when the primary election rolls around, that the broader electorate is going to kind of do something slightly different than what happens at that pre-primary convention. And with independents thrown into the mix this year, a lot of people thought that her opponent, Sam Bregman, would do better in the primary, but he did not. So we had 3/4 of independents voting with Democrats who came out en masse and gave almost an identical result during the primary. And she's largely known as a progressive. So I kind of view it as the small group of independents, because it was a small turnout among independents, which I do believe will grow as they become more aware of their ability to vote in the primary. Most of them joined with the progressives in the Democratic Party to deliver the same result that we saw in the pre-primary convention. So I think it's kind of has a lot to do with the current mood. It's the mood of the electorate right now. And it shows that the Democrats are fired up. The independents who chose to show up mostly voted with the Democrats, and they helped produce the same result this striking endorsement of Deb Haaland. And I think it has real implications for going into the general election. I think for Republicans, it's going to be an uphill battle.
Well, Marjorie, you're helping me out because that's a perfect segue. Coming up during this last segment of Next Talk New Mexico, we're going to be previewing some of the races in the general election, and we'd like to hear from you. You can still give us a ring. The phone lines remain open at 505-277-5866, or you can email letstalk@kunm.org. Talking about that general election, it's headed our way in November. Keep it right here. You are listening to Let's Talk New Mexico on listener-supported KUNM. I'm your host, Mark Haslett. Good to have you with us this morning. Hope you are enjoying the June in our beautiful state. Yes, it's a little bit on the toasty side, but we're used to that sort of thing. Joining us in the studios this morning, we have Dee Dee Feldman. She's a former Democratic state senator. Merritt Allen, who is a conservative activist. We have Bob Pearls, chair of New Mexico Forward Party, and Marjorie Childress, who is the managing editor of New Mexico In Depth. In addition to that panel, we have a call. Bill in Los Lunas is calling. Good morning, Bill. What would you like to add to the conversation this morning?
Good morning, Mark, and welcome.
Well, thank you.
Good morning, ladies. How you doing?
Okay.
Good, thanks.
Okay. I'm always have a pleasant thought on Democrats and the Republican skulls fighting, whatever you want to call it. But what I enjoy the most is when little mouse crosses the path of an 8-ton elephant. What is the reaction of the 8-ton elephant? And then I'm going to give you this word. Write them down. Write the letters down. M, MAGA. A, against. G, Great America. A, America. What's it? What word did it come out?
I don't know. You're going to have to help us out, Bill. Tell us.
MAGA.
Okay.
MAGA against Great America. Now write the first letters down of those words. MAGA against Great America.
All right, Bill, I thank you so much for calling in this morning. Bill from Los Lunas. You're listening to Let's Talk New Mexico on listener-supported KUNM. One of the things that I love about public radio is that we kind of get under the hood and talks about some details and some aspects of things that don't get mentioned in more superficial treatments of topics. And if y'all don't mind, I'd like to nerd out a little bit on the Commissioner of Public Lands office. We're going to hear a lot about the gubernatorial race and some of the other statewide, of course, the congressional and Senate. But that public lands commissioner, would anybody who's feeling confident in their civics skills care to give the audience a thumbnail sketch of what the public lands commissioner does?
Well, New Mexico has a number of permanent funds that come from the interest and the revenue that the state lands, which were granted to New Mexico by the Enabling Act in 1912 to oil and gas and other extractive industries and other educational institutions. Actually, these funds generate revenue for New Mexico, and by Constitution, they go into largely the schools and higher education institutions. So the state land office governs the royalty rates, the rents, the leases, and sometimes it's ranchers and cattlemen who lease state lands to run their cattle, and those rents and royalties then provide an important source of funding for New Mexico. So that's what the Commissioner of Public Lands do. It's only in the West that the Commissioner of Public Lands exists, where there's lots of state land. It doesn't really exist back east.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. Merritt, you have something?
Well, and what we're potentially looking at is we also now have a New Mexican who is the director of the Bureau of Land Management at the Department of the Interior, and who is the most recent departed chair of the Republican Party of New Mexico, and a former congressman for Congressional District 2, Steve Pierce. And part of the infighting that's happening at RPNM is whether the Pierce faction or new leadership comes in. So it's peeling back the layers as we do on in public radio. There's more to it than that. So what happens if you have a land commissioner and a director of the Bureau of Land Management at odds with each other? It's kind of a big deal.
What ideological differences cause them to be in this rift with one another?
Oil and gas leases.
Okay, specifically, what attitudes or policy preferences?
Well, for instance, our current land commissioner has been rather strict and had a different view on the oil and gas industry, perhaps, than you might see with a Republican or someone who comes from the oil and gas industry. If you have a conservationist mindset as opposed to an extraction industry mindset, that's a very different way to manage our public lands. And so, of course, Steve Pierce comes from the oil industry, and he's at BLM. So you could definitely see different and clashing ideologies there.
It's about public lands. It's about public lands, federal public lands and state public lands. I think that, there's a fear amongst environmentalists that Pierce or a Republican land commissioner would sell off some of the public lands to private industry. And in New Mexico, the current public lands commissioner, who is Stephanie Garcia Richard, has been a tough negotiator with oil and gas. She has enacted a ban on leasing for a 10-mile radius around the Chaco Canyon, for example. And that was actually supported for federal lands by Deb Haaland when she was. So it's a pretty controversial issue here in New Mexico.
And push for increased royalty payments.
Marjorie, I'm going to call upon your expertise on the funding issue here for a moment. Coming up in the general election on the Democratic side, the candidate for Public Lands Commissioner, Juan Sanchez, he'll be going up against Republican Michael Perry. In the Democratic primary, Juan Sanchez defeated Matthew McQueen, and Source New Mexico reported a political action committee that got much of its money from Chevron bought TV ads supporting Sanchez. McQueen said during the campaign that he would not accept money from fossil fuel companies. How important were those dynamics in the Democratic primary for the land commissioner nomination?
Well, Juan Sanchez has deep ties within the Democratic Party, so he's definitely not an outsider to the Democratic Party. This outside oil and gas money, when I think about that, this is just a hunch on my part. I haven't done enough of a deep dive on reporting on Juan Sanchez's possible positions when if he wins this race. But Matthew McQueen, I think, is a known entity to the oil and gas industry. He's known as an environmentalist. He would not take oil and gas money. So it doesn't surprise me that they came in and ran ads to support his opponent. That's kind of my view on that. These state trust lands, oil and gas is incredibly interested because they want to lease those lands and they want to do production on them. It's almost as easy as that to me. And so, they came in, I think, to oppose Matthew McQueen's, to oppose Matthew McQueen. That's the way I view that. And Dee Dee, you might have a different perspective. I'd like to hear it, but I don't really think it says much about the positions that Juan Sanchez will take, other than the fact that he did accept, apparently he accepted some oil and gas money.
Do the Public Land Commissioner, I remember when I was reading about Project Jupiter, one of the obstacles, I guess you could say, that Project Jupiter is facing is that there's a stretch of land that they need the right to build a gas line through that stretch of land. Would the Commissioner of Public Lands office, would he have any sort of final say on what happens with that stretch of land? Do any of y'all know?
Yes. And Stephanie Garcia Richard has said that she's not going to allow that pipeline to go through. So the big question, if I was a reporter asking Juan Sanchez and Michael Perry, is what's your position on that? I think that's, by the way, the race to watch during the general election. I think that's going to be the real competitive race.
Because Michael Perry, I think he's got a profile that might really appeal to Democrats, some Democrats, and centrist, middle of the road folks. So, I think the Republican Party has put up a good candidate there.
Katie? I'm sorry, Merritt.
Yeah, he's a former game warden and he's a former assistant land commissioner. So, he knows his stuff. He has done his homework and he's eminently qualified. So he's. I agree with Marjorie. This is going to be a tough one.
Yeah.
Yes.
I also wanted to chime in that I have met Michael Perry. I was impressed with him. I have not met the Democrat, but I liked what Perry said, and what's appealing to independents and forward party supporters is that he said very clearly out loud in front of a Republican audience that he's not going to be Republican, that he's going to work with everybody. He's going to work on a nonpartisan or transpartisan basis. That's what I want to hear from every candidate from every major party.
Exactly.
You're listening to Let's Talk New Mexico on listener-supported KUNM. Coming up next on KUNM at 10 o'clock, it's Democracy Now! We invite you to stay with us for that broadcast. This morning, we are discussing elections in New Mexico. We've talked about the just completed semi-open party primary elections, and now we're previewing the races coming up in the general in November. We don't have time to talk about all of them, but we still have a few minutes to hit onto a couple of them. I'd like to ask Merritt what you think about the 2nd Congressional District race featuring incumbent Democrat Gabe Vasquez and Republican Greg Cunningham. What's your perspective on that as we approach the general?
Well, I think it would be a far more interesting race if CD2 looked anything like it did in 2020. But now that Roswell, is split into 3 congressional districts, that district is so tortured. But Gabe Vasquez can still barely hang on to it. So
he did win by 10,000 votes last time.
But it's not exactly a blue tsunami. That was the goal. And that was the goal of redistricting, was to get Yvette Harrell out of it. They succeeded. Gabe Vasquez is not a particularly strong congressman because he has to kind of please everybody. So he is not nearly as, say, progressive as Stansbury or Leger Fernandez because he still has to, speak to Roswell. So it's pretty interesting. If he goes back on his record, what is his record? It's mushy. So the problem is Greg Cunningham seems to say, I'm going all in with Trump. Well, that's not going to win. It is absolutely not going to win Las Cruces, and he needs Las Cruces. And the problem with CD2 is you have to win Las Cruces and you have to win Roswell and a little bit of Albuquerque. And that is, to Bob's point, is speaking to the issues and standing up for your constituents and standing up for all of them. And you're not going to do that on a hyper-partisan platform.
Bob, yeah, please go ahead.
No, I think you were about to ask me about maybe another race. Let me just put a plug in for the fact that the Forward Party is running a statewide candidate for a state auditor. There was no Republican, and sticking with us wanting to not be a spoiler. Michael V. Hill is a CPA. He would be the first. He's running with the Forward Party for state auditor. He would be the first CPA in 25 years in the state auditor race. All the other state auditors have used it as a political stepping stone. None of them have had a financial background, including our current Democratic incumbent. And so we're very excited about the fact that we have the most competent, the most experienced guy who was CFO for Albuquerque Public Schools, has been in public accounting for 25 years. He's well known and well supported by Democrats and Republicans for this race. And so we're providing competition in a race where it's basically a one-on-one race. The Republicans threw in a last-minute write-in candidate who is patently unqualified to serve, I would say, in any office, but certainly in the state auditor's office.
Well, I need to stick up for my friend Joseph Maestas, who is the current state auditor, who has done a great job and has investigated corruption in Las Cruces, in northern New Mexico, Mora, and he's done a great job. And I mean, he's had every other office. He doesn't really need a stepping stone. So. I'm glad there's a race in that for that office, but I think there's clearly a superior candidate.
Marjorie, you're not happy about that map. I have to point out that the courts did uphold it, but I imagine have you talked to folks in Roswell? Are they irritated with being broken up into different districts?
Of course they are, and that goes, the courts are, different courts. That would be the U.S. Supreme Court. They're also holding up gerrymandering, and I don't think any of us like that either. So, gerrymandering is not okay.
The districting process, gerrymandering, all of that stuff, that sounds to me like a future topic for another program.
We'd love to come back. I think all of us.
Yeah, I think there's plenty to talk about with that one. You've been listening to Let's Talk New Mexico on listener-supported KUNM. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we appreciate not just our audience, but also our panel. Marjorie Childress, the managing editor of New Mexico in Depth, joined us from McKinley County via Zoom. We've been speaking with Merritt Allen, who is the founder of the center-right opinion website, meritocracy.news. That's with 2 T's. Bob Pearls, state chair of the New Mexico Forward Party. And last and quite far from least, we have T.D. Feldman, longtime Democratic state legislator and still involved in things. You can find all kinds of wonderful things related to this program at